My dad was a buyer at Xerox. Prior to working at Xerox, he worked for a company called Jarl Extrusion and learned a lot about manufacturing at that time. Got to know a little bit about his end customer, which was Xerox. Thought it was really interesting. Xerox was in those days growing like crazy. So he took a position in purchasing, worked his way up through the organization. I was the fourth child that had just been born, and he felt like his path at Xerox was going to be limited. So he decided to go off on his own and start his own organization, which at the time was basically taking the family station wagon and going out, finding companies to sell for, and then going and finding customers. And so one of the first companies that he represented was a company in East Syracuse, New York, called Armstrong Mold. At the time, it was John and Betty Armstrong were the only employees basically in the company. And John was essentially pouring castings in his garage and in his basement. And my dad had got some jobs at what was at the time, I believe, GE Defense, which is now Lockheed Martin in Syracuse. And so that was kind of the start. It was a real challenge. Back then, if you think about it, the New York State Thruway didn't exist. Cell phones didn't exist. You would literally, head off on the road towards Albany, be stopping to use payphones along the way, and, literally would probably be on the road for 2-3 days at a time. And as a manufacturer's rep, had to finance his entire business until he got orders and then eventually got paid by the manufacturers. So it was a really tough road in the beginning. He eventually brought the second employee on, which was a guy named Jim Robbins, and Jim covered Xerox. And, as time went on, we grew from Xerox and calling on Kodak, and then spread into New England, and then down into really more the mid-Atlantic, and then maybe about 25 years ago, started spreading further south, down along the eastern seaboard, and then out into the western states. It's interesting. People have asked what my dad's vision was when he started the company. I don't know that he had a roadmap on day one. I think he was unhappy with, where he was with Xerox, and he would see other folks coming in and calling on him as a buyer, and he really wasn't that impressed, and he felt like I could do a better job than they were doing. And he felt like, he could go out and find good manufacturers and really grow their business. And, over the years, he was very focused on building an organization. And so he would hire people to go out and grow the business, to make sales calls, hire other salespeople, whereas a lot of his peers or other people who were manufacturers rep at the time were kind of just on their own, one or two people, and they never really had the vision to grow into a larger organization. And a lot of that growth came out of the demands of having built good relationships with some manufacturers and them wanting to count on my dad and the organization to say, hey, we'd like you to help us in this other territory. Can you bring someone else on to cover that? Because you're doing a really good job, here in New York or New England or what have you. So it kind of grew. How did he come across an Armstrong Mold or a Klaus Stamping as some of our first manufacturers? And usually it was a customer would say, hey, I can't find anyone to make this casting, or I heard about companies out in Minnesota that are doing this process called short run stamping. Can you find me someone who can do this? And so he literally would start asking around, go get in the car and go track down someone who could make whatever that product or that part was.
I think Al Lupton Sr. was hired in 1971. It was a year after we had started the company, and Al was the first sales rep we ever had. Al Sr. flew out and he was hired, and then from that point we started doing work in upstate New York, primarily with Xerox.
And so in the case of Klaus Stamping, he literally flew out to Minnesota and met Everett Clow, who was the founder of Klaus Stamping, again, operating out of his garage. He had just left another short run stamper and had started his own business. And my dad, met with him and said, hey, I can bring you a bunch of business from Xerox. Is that of interest? And that's kind of what started the relationship.
He was very professional. He communicated very well. He had a really good idea of the type of customer that would fit cloth stamping. Again, he was the first one we had, and we learned a lot from sales reps or having one. And without expanding out to other parts of the country, we would have never grown to be as big as we are today. It was really a start. With Al, we determined that we can provide stampings to companies that were outside the Twin City area. It was a very good beginning for us to branch off into New York and other locations afterward.
I think our average tenure with our manufacturers is north of 25 years. And, much of that is because we've got some really solid relationships that literally go back to the early 70s. So companies like Cloth Stamping, Armstrong Mold, PGM, which is in Rochester, many of these firms we've been with for a very, very long time. And again, the chemistry's right. They're family-owned businesses. And we've, through the years, challenged each other to keep growing and to get better every day. And so they focused on manufacturing, and we've focused on sales and marketing and trying to go out and find the next big opportunity, the next, significant logo that will help propel their growth and challenge them to get better in a certain technology or in a certain way. So, a lot of our legacy is built around the legacy of our manufacturers.
Eventually, we ended up landing another account in your area called Eastman Kodak. Everybody knows them, and that relationship went on for a long time. And then eventually we started doing work for NCR, National Cash Registers in New York, and also IBM. We did probably 6 or 7 locations for IBM throughout the United States. And a lot of it was really started with the relationship with Al Sr., which continued with Al Jr. So they were very aggressive. They were always looking for new accounts. And it's the same today. We're always looking for new accounts because your customer base tends to turn over every 15 or 20 years, and it has. We've got a completely different customer base now than we did back then.
I remember one of Al's famous rules of thumb, I guess, if you might say it, and that's the thing I always liked is that, keeping it practical, keeping it simple, was that he used to say that buyer has to want to see you get the order. So that's the relationship you need to build. And, to editorialize what that meant to me is if I had the best price and my factory was located next door and the best delivery, if that buyer didn't want to do business with me, they would find a way not to do business with me. So that's first and foremost. I had to sell myself. And secondly, sell the principle and then sell the product. And those are some things I learned from Al. Through the 33, almost 34 years at Lupton Associates, I built a lot of lasting relationships with the Lupton family, with my coworkers who I still am in touch with, a lot of them nowadays, with principals who I'm still in touch with, and with customers. And to this day, I actively keep in touch and meet, maybe a couple times a year with a lot of them. And that's a big part of my life, and it has been a big part of my
life. A couple things to mention about my dad, which folks who worked with him would know. But anytime he would walk into one of our manufacturers' facilities, or even sometimes some customer facilities where he was close to, he knew everybody, and he had a very deep engagement with folks and really cared about, how they were doing, making sure that things were going well for them. And, at the end of the day, he would often talk about the reason why he was successful is because people wanted to see him get an order. And so when you think about that, having someone want to see you get the order is really about them, helping coach you to say, hey, these are the things you need to think about, or you've got to beef up your quality systems, or you need to add this capability. It's not something that happens overnight. And so again, when he would approach one of the manufacturers and say, in a very nice way, wow, your quality system's really lacking, or, we need to be on time with our deliveries, or these types of things, folks would really take that message very strongly because it came from him, and they knew that he was genuinely concerned for their business and for the success of his customers. To ask around of people who were his contemporaries and worked with him, it would be, that he was very passionate about taking care of the customer, taking care of the manufacturer, taking care of the people that work at all of those businesses.
His leadership style was one-on-one. Once again, I'll use the word very practical, just trying to help me along to see the kind of things I needed to learn about the principles, about dealing with customers, and trying to maintain that balance. I remember a story that Al told me about what the manufacturer's rep business is like. And back in the 50s and 60s, there was a program called Ed Sullivan Show. And Al said, do you remember when you were a kid and you watched the Ed Sullivan Show and they had a guy on there that spun the plates on a stick, and he would spin one plate, he'd go on to the next plate, he'd go on to the next plate, and then he'd have to go back to the first and second plates and keep them spinning. Then he'd start a new plate. And that, he said, was basically what the manufacturer's rep business was. You had to, juggle a lot of balls in the air and be aware of the customer needs, be aware of the principal needs, and walk that fine line.
Al was known as a whittler. Al would never take a big problem and tear it apart and come up with an immediate solution. He would whittle away at it and take it one piece at a time. And I think that's one of the reasons he was so successful, is he was doing multitasking, doing a lot of different things. He would talk about spinning plates and keeping all the plates spinning at the same time. And I think that's part of what we have to do working with all of our different principals, is there's different cultures at the different companies we work for, and we have to keep all those people happy. It was always a pleasure working with Al. He was a lot of fun to work with, and he had a great sense of humor. I think one of the best features was the fact that Al would never give you a yes or no answer to a question you might have. He would give you kind of multiple choice solutions, if you will, similar to what I think a good sermon would be in church, where you walk away from the sermon and spend the rest of the day thinking about which approach to take. Also, I think Al had an immense respect for others, and he was very highly respected by the folks that we worked for. Many times I heard principals would ask a question to Al directly about whether they should buy another piece of equipment, which path they should go down, those kinds of things. So it was very unique that way.
We had a good time. We had a good relationship over the years, and I learned a lot from Al. I like his practical approach to selling. It was just really just practical and down to earth. It was just getting to know the customer, getting to know their needs, not a lot of, for today's verbiage, analytics, just getting to know what the customer wanted and get the customer to like you, so that they wanted to do business with you and have a relationship with you, and find out what the customer's needs were, and then trying to fill those needs with the principles we brought to the table.
Al Sr. is probably one of the few people that's walking planet Earth, or at the time, of course, Al has passed, unfortunately, that I never heard one person say anything negative. He was just a class individual. He was very humble, very soft-spoken, but just was epitomized class and kindness, and he just was tremendous. And the principals thought highly of Al Sr. Everybody who worked here loved him. And again, he reminded me of my grandfather, but he just was someone who just epitomized class and kindness. And again, never heard him curse, never saw him get angry. He just was an incredible person, and honored to have known him. I loved him. He spent some time here, met my family. I got to travel with him a couple times, especially early on when I first started, and just feel blessed that I knew him before he passed.
So a lot of folks knew my dad from a business standpoint, and there was definitely some crossover personally. But my dad was, pretty accomplished when he was probably, I'm going to guess, 8 years old. He contracted polio, and probably spent the next 4 or 5 years really in a very tough, challenging medical environment where he was trying to recover from polio. Spent time in an iron lung, had countless numbers of surgeries, and ultimately, he was right-handed and he lost the use of his right arm. So probably at the age of like 12, he really had to kind of start teaching himself how to do everything, not only with just one arm, but also left-handed. So over time, he would go to Sonnenberg Gardens, which was right around the corner from his house, and he literally would hit hundreds and hundreds of tennis balls a day, teaching himself how to play tennis. He was always very committed to doing the best that he could at whatever he decided to do. So this is kind of a funny story, but he actually tried out for the basketball team and he was absolutely horrible and just was not going to make the basketball team. And so he decided, again, at an early age, he was going to try to play tennis. He then would go to Sonnenberg. He'd hit hundreds of tennis balls a day against the backboard. Eventually would start playing matches against other people and got to be really good at tennis, mostly self-taught. Over time, he had some people that would give him lessons and things like that. But, in high school, he ended up playing tennis all 4 years. Both played singles and doubles. I think his record was undefeated in high school, and I think he was almost undefeated in college. So he is actually in the Athletic Hall of Fame, both at Canandaigua High School and at Rochester Institute of Technology. So again, it's interesting how he was able to teach himself, different sports with only the use of one arm. And so he also did the same with golf. He felt like golf was an important sport to learn from a business standpoint. And so again, he just went to the driving range and just kept hitting balls and trying to figure out, how to swing a club with just one hand. And, over time he became very accomplished and got himself down as a single digit, golfer and, loved the game and, played his whole life.
My father-in-law, Chick Yulin, and Al Sr. were good friends, and I ended up playing quite a few rounds of golf with them prior to knowing anything about the agency. And as it turned out, I think Al was actually kind of doing the early pre-interview or staging me up at that point for what might come in the future. After I was hired, Al's favorite thing was conferencing, which was actually another term for a synonym for golfing. And we had sales meetings on an almost weekly basis in the summertime. And that's, Al would wait to the 12th or 14th hole and ask you a question about how the territory was out. But other than that, it was just fun golf.
As I say, Al was a down-to-earth guy, and he liked to have fun. And I remember one of his favorite things that he had for a year. He used to have a little envelope, and on it said rattlesnake eggs. And he would hand it to somebody, and you'd open it up, and it would rattle like a rattlesnake. And what was inside there was simply a rubber band with a washer round between a wire form. And when you open the envelope, the thing started to unwind and sound like a rattlesnake. And he used that joke on a lot of people, customers, principals, and several other people. And we had a lot of fun with that. Al had a unique ability to get people at ease. He was just down to earth. It was, like talking to your family, like talking to your best friends. It wasn't a we-they situation. It was an us type of relationship with Al had with everybody.
When I first started, I was at the company about a month, and they announced they were going to have a sales meeting at Daufuskie Island down in South Carolina. And I said to Al Sr. at the time, well, I don't think I should go because I'm only so new with the company. And he's like, oh, no, you're going. You're part of this team. We had a marathon for flights. And then we arrived in Georgia. We had to pack, I think, 20 plus sets of golf clubs onto two 12 passengers vans. And Al had his Tahoe as well. And from there, we drove to Hilton Head. And then we disembarked onto a ferry, which took us to the island. And the following morning, we all got up and golfed together as a group. And that night, Al Sr. got up in front of the group and said something that I'll never forget. And that was that he thanked all the wives at the very beginning of the meeting for their tolerating him, I guess. He said, I might not be your favorite person and favorite name because of the fact that your husbands are away from home a lot with work. And I know how hard it is to manage a family, and I appreciate all that you guys do relative to the family, and also these guys can go out and sell for me. And I don't want that to go unheard. So I want to make sure that everybody's aware of the fact that I appreciate the effort put forward by all the wives. And he made that very clear, very, very quickly in that meeting. And I thought that was very genuine and sincere.
And again, the way he handled business, the way he treated people, and I think it shows through the people that worked at the company in those early years that stayed for so many years and never left. And I think a big part of that was Al Sr.
He was a great guy. Great guy. Everybody loved Al. That's for sure.